My name is Annalise. For the last 15 years, the salt-laced air of Port Blossom has been the rhythm of my breath, the steady cadence of the Pacific waves against the shore, the metronome of my life. I came here seeking quietude after a storm and found it in the hushed aisles of the town's public library, where I became the keeper of stories, surrounded by the gentle scent of aging paper and pine-scented floor polish. My own story had been a quiet one, a life lived in the calm interlude between chapters, until I met David. David was a widower, a man whose kindness was etched into the fine lines around his eyes. He was a woodworker, his hands calloused but gentle, capable of coaxing beauty from the gnarled heart of a fallen Douglas fir. He had a daughter, Chloe, a young woman poised on the cusp of adulthood when we met. She was 17 then, with her father's warm eyes and a smile that seemed, at first, as bright and promising as a sunrise over the Cascade Mountains. Our courtship was a gentle waltz, a slow and careful weaving of two lives into one. When David asked me to marry him on a misty morning at the edge of the sea cliff, with the gulls crying overhead, my yes was as natural and certain as the turning of the tide. I believed we were building a new family, a sturdy vessel meant to sail on calm waters. I knew being a stepmother would be a delicate navigation, but my heart was open, full of a love that I was eager to share. I never imagined that the deepest, most treacherous currents were not in the wide open sea, but waiting within the very harbor I so longed to call home. The early days were painted in soft hues of hope. I moved into the home David had built, a beautiful cedar-shingled house nestled amongst ferns and tall pines, with windows that looked out onto the choppy gray-blue of the Sound. I tried to tread softly, to respect the memories that lived within those walls. The ghost of David's first wife, Elizabeth, was a gentle presence, her smile captured in silver frames on the mantelpiece. I never sought to erase her. I only hoped to add my own chapter to the family story. Chloe was polite, if distant. She called me Annalise, her voice always carefully neutral. I would make her favorite lemon poppy seed muffins for breakfast. She would thank me quietly and eat one before disappearing to her room. I'd ask about her classes, her friends, her art. She was a gifted painter, and receive short, curated answers that offered no real entry into her world. She just needs time, David would say, his hand finding mine in the quiet evenings after Chloe had retreated behind her closed door. It's a big change for her. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. The true architect of the growing chill was her maternal grandmother, Evelyn, a woman as polished and unyielding as the marble on her city apartment's floors. Evelyn lived 2 hours away in Seattle, but her influence stretched across the miles like a dense, rolling fog. She would visit on weekends, her expensive car gliding silently into our gravel driveway, bringing with her a palpable tension. "It's wonderful that David has found companionship," she said to me once, her smile a thin, bloodless line. She stood in my garden, gesturing with a manicured hand at the blossoming rhododendrons I had so carefully tended. But a child only has one true mother. It's a primal bond, you understand. Irreplaceable. Her words were like carefully placed stones, dropped into the still pool of my hope, sending ripples of doubt and insecurity outward. I would see her speaking to Chloe in low, urgent whispers in the corner of the living room, Chloe's head bowed, her expression unreadable. After these visits, the wall around Chloe would be higher, the distance in her eyes more pronounced. One afternoon, I found Chloe in the small studio David had built for her above the garage. She was staring at a half-finished canvas, her brush limp in her hand. The air smelled of turpentine and frustration. "It's beautiful," I said softly, looking at the moody seascape taking shape. "You have such a talent for capturing the light here." She didn't turn. "Grandma Evelyn says I get it from my mother. She says Mom was the real artist in the family." "I'm sure she was," I agreed gently. "But this talent is yours, Chloe. It comes from you." She finally looked at me, her eyes flat and cold. You wouldn't understand. You're not part of this family. Not really. The words were a physical blow, sharp and stunning. I felt the air leave my lungs. I had been trying so hard, pouring so much of myself into building a bridge to her, only to be told I was standing on the wrong side of the canyon entirely. "Chloe," David said sharply from the doorway. He had overheard. "That's an unkind thing to say. Annalise is my wife. But she's not my mother." Chloe's voice cracked, a fissure in her carefully controlled facade. The raw pain in it was startling. "And she never will be. Stop trying to make her be." She threw her brush down, splattering cerulean blue across the floorboards, and fled, her footsteps thundering down the wooden stairs. David sighed, a heavy, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of all his unspoken grief. He came and wrapped his arms around me. "I'm so sorry, Annie," he murmured into my hair. "She's just confused. Evelyn gets in her head." I leaned against him, absorbing his warmth, but a seed of fear had been planted in my heart. It wasn't confusion I had seen in Chloe's eyes. It was a conviction, a cold and hard belief that had been forged in the fires of someone else's bitterness. And I was the one who was getting burned. The shift from quiet resentment to open manipulation was as gradual and insidious as a rising tide. It began after Chloe, to our profound disappointment, dropped out of her prestigious art program in her second year. She returned home to Port Blossom adrift, her days unstructured, her ambitions seemingly extinguished. A subtle bitterness now clung to her like the persistent coastal mist. The polite distance of her teenage years curdled into something sharper, more demanding. It started with money. Not large sums, at first. $100 here for art supplies that never seemed to materialize into new paintings. $200 there for a weekend workshop in the city she would return from with new clothes but no new skills. David, ever the hopeful father, saw it as a way of supporting her while she found herself. He'd hand over the cash with a gentle admonition to be careful, his eyes full of a love that blinded him to the growing transactional nature of their relationship. I tried to talk to him about it. "David, don't you think we should be encouraging her to get a job, to find some structure? Just giving her money isn't helping her." "She's grieving, Annie," he'd say, his voice tight with defensiveness. "She's lost. We need to be patient with her." My own patience was wearing thin. The atmosphere in our home, once a sanctuary of peace, was now charged with an unspoken tension. I felt like I was walking on eggshells, my every suggestion or question about Chloe's future met with a defensive glare from her and a placating look from my husband. The first major demand came on a rainy Tuesday. I was in the kitchen, cataloging new acquisitions for the library, when Chloe walked in, bypassing the coffee pot and standing directly in front of me. "I need $3,000, she said, her tone flat, as if she were announcing the time. I looked up from my laptop, startled. $3,000? For what? "There's an intensive photography course I want to take. It's a deposit for the program. It starts next month." Her gaze was direct, challenging. "Chloe, that's a lot of money," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "That's something you need to discuss with your father. We should talk about it together, as a family." A flicker of something ugly crossed her face. "I am talking to you. Dad will just do whatever you say anyway. Everyone knows you control the money." The accusation was so baseless, so venomous, that it left me momentarily speechless. David and I had always made financial decisions together, transparently and with mutual respect. "That's not true, and you know it," I said, my voice firmer now. "We can't just hand over that kind of money without a serious conversation." Her eyes narrowed. "Fine. Don't give it to me. But when I tell Grandma Evelyn how you're keeping Dad's money from his own daughter, I'm sure she'll have some thoughts." I bet her lawyer would, too. The threat, veiled as it was, hung in the air between us, thick and poisonous. The idea of Evelyn, with her wealth and her malice, sicking a lawyer on us was chilling. Chloe saw the flicker of fear in my eyes and pressed her advantage. "It would be so much easier if you just helped me out," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I'm just trying to get my life back on track." I thought you'd want to support that. That night, David and I had the worst fight of our marriage. He accused me of not trusting Chloe, of being uncharitable. I accused him of being willfully blind, of enabling a behavior that was becoming more and more destructive. In the end, exhausted and heartbroken, we compromised. We gave her the money. It was a mistake. It was like feeding a stray animal that then sees your home as its territory. The demands grew more frequent, the emotional blackmail more overt. She began to subtly poison my relationships in our small town. A casual, concern-sounding comment to a member of the library board about my stress levels. A tearful confession to a mutual friend about how difficult it was living with a stepmother who was so critical. Evelyn, of course, fanned the flames. During one of her visits, she cornered me while I was weeding my herb garden. "You know," she began, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "Chloe tells me things. She feels so scrutinized in this house. It must be difficult for you, I imagine, stepping into a role you weren't naturally meant for. Perhaps you're trying a little too hard." I stood up, soil on my knees and a fire in my chest. "What I am trying to do, Evelyn, is be a loving wife and a supportive parent." "What are you trying to do?" Her smile was glacial. "I'm simply protecting my granddaughter's interests. And her mother's memory." She turned and walked back toward the house, leaving me shaking with a helpless rage. I was being painted as the villain in a story I didn't write, the wicked stepmother in a fairy tale spun from bitterness and lies. David was caught in the middle, torn between the woman he loved and the daughter he couldn't bear to see as anything but his perfect, grieving girl. The foundation of our peaceful life was cracking, and I felt myself starting to fall through. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that this was only the beginning. Chloe was learning just how much power she wielded, and she was only just beginning to test its limits. The announcement of Chloe's engagement to Liam Albright felt less like a joyous occasion and more like the beginning of a final, terrible act in a play I desperately wanted to exit. The Albrights were one of Port Blossom's founding families, old money that had mellowed into quiet respectability. They owned the largest timber concern in the county, and their name was synonymous with integrity and community philanthropy. Liam was a genuinely kind, steady young man who looked at Chloe with an adoration that was painful to witness, because I could see it wasn't reciprocated with the same sincerity. I saw in Chloe's eyes a flicker of triumph, the look of someone who had just secured a prize. The engagement escalated everything. Suddenly, the financial demands weren't for vague courses, but for a wedding worthy of the Albright name. The cost of the venue, the designer dress, the caterer, each new expense was presented as a non-negotiable necessity. David, swept up in the fantasy of his daughter's happiness and perhaps intimidated by the Albrights' standing, agreed to almost everything, draining their savings with a heavy heart and a forced smile. My attempts to inject reason were met with accusations of jealousy. "You're just bitter because your wedding to Dad was so simple," Chloe sneered one afternoon when I questioned the need for a $5,000 floral budget. "You don't want me to have the beautiful day my mother would have wanted for me." She had learned to wield the memory of her mother like a shield and a sword, simultaneously defending her own selfishness and cutting me down. David would flinch every time she did it, and the conversation would end. The final straw, the one that broke the last vestiges of my hope and forced me to see the abyss ahead, came about a month before the wedding. I was a well-respected figure in Port Blossom, not just as the head librarian, but as a mentor to many young people. I ran a popular teen literacy program, a safe space where kids could explore ideas and find their voice. It was my life's work, the part of my identity that was wholly mine. Chloe came to me one evening as I was preparing for bed. David was already asleep. She didn't knock, just pushed the door open and stood there, a silhouette against the hallway light. "The final payment for the photographer is due," she said without preamble. "It's $2,000. I sat up, my heart sinking. Chloe, we've talked about this. Your father and I have already contributed far more than we originally agreed. The Albrights have been incredibly generous. There has to be a limit. I don't think you understand, she said, and the gentleness was gone from her voice, replaced by something cold and hard. This isn't a request. She took a step into the room. I know things about you, Annalise. About your life before you came here. Before you met my dad. My blood ran cold. My life before Port Blossom held a chapter of deep sorrow, a painful divorce followed by a period of depression that I had worked hard to overcome. It was a private history, one I had shared with David in confidence. I was talking to Grandma Evelyn, she continued, her voice a silken threat. She's very resourceful. It's amazing what you can find in public records if you know where to look. It would be a shame if certain details about your past were to become common knowledge. People in this town look up to you. The parents of those teenagers in your little book club. They trust you. I wonder if they would, if they knew you weren't the perfect saint you pretend to be. I stared at her, horrified. This was no longer about money or wedding fripperies. This was a violation. She was threatening to excavate my deepest wounds and display them publicly to hurt me, to control me. She was threatening my career, my standing, my very sense of self. Get out, I whispered, my voice trembling with a rage so profound it felt like ice in my veins. She smiled, a small, triumphant curl of her lips. The check can be made out to Bella Photography. I'll pick it up in the morning. She turned and left, closing the door softly behind her. I sat in the darkness, shaking. The tears I had held back for so long finally came, not hot tears of sadness, but cold tears of fury and violation. Something inside me snapped. The part of me that had been patient, that had made excuses, that had held on to hope, died in that moment. She hadn't just threatened my reputation, she had taken the story of my past pain and fashioned it into a weapon. I looked at my sleeping husband, his face peaceful in the moonlight, and felt a surge of desperate clarity. He couldn't protect me from this. He couldn't even see it. I was alone in this fight. The gentle, quiet librarian was gone, and in her place was a woman who was finally, terrifyingly, ready to push back. If Chloe wanted a war, she would get one. But I wouldn't fight with her weapons of blackmail and lies. I would fight with the one thing she and her grandmother seemed to have forgotten existed, the truth. The path forward revealed itself 2 days later, on a gray, drizzling afternoon that matched my mood. I was in the daily grind, Port Blossom's favorite coffee shop, nursing a lukewarm tea and trying to quiet the storm in my mind. The bell above the door chimed, and a young man walked in, shaking the rain from his coat. I recognized him instantly, Julian Vance. He had been Chloe's boyfriend for nearly a year, back before she went to art school. He was a good kid, a fisherman's son with an honest face and kind eyes. They had broken up abruptly, and Chloe had only ever said that he was immature and had no ambition. He saw me and hesitated, then gave a small, polite nod. On impulse, I called his name. Julian. Hello. He came over to my table, looking surprised. Mrs. Miller. Annalise. Hi. How are you? I'm all right, I lied. Could I buy you a coffee? I'd love to catch up for a moment, if you have time. He looked wary, but he agreed. As we sat there, making small talk about the fishing season and his work on his father's boat, I could see a sadness in his eyes that I recognized. I decided to take a risk. Julian, I said, my voice low. I know this is out of the blue, and please, feel free to tell me it's none of my business. But I was always so sad when you and Chloe broke up. I thought you were wonderful for her. He stared down into his coffee cup, his knuckles white. A humorless laugh escaped him. Yeah, well, I wasn't good enough, was I? Not ambitious enough. Not rich enough. Is that what she told you? I asked gently. He finally looked at me, and it was as if a dam broke. The story poured out of him, a torrent of hurt and confusion. It turned out their breakup wasn't about his lack of ambition. It was because he had started to question the stories Chloe told him about her family life. She had me convinced you were this monster, he said, his face flushed with shame. She said you were cold and controlling, that you managed every penny David earned and made her feel like a beggar in her own home. She said her dad was so beaten down by you he couldn't even stand up for her. She cried all the time. She said her only refuge was her grandmother. I listened, my heart a heavy stone in my chest. It was my own life, twisted into a grotesque caricature. She would ask me for money, he continued, his voice barely a whisper. Said it was for things she needed that you wouldn't let her have. Said you were trying to erase her mother's memory from the house. I believed her. I gave her everything I had saved. He shook his head, the self-recrimination clear in his eyes. The lies just got bigger and bigger. The last straw was when she told me David had hit her once in a fight over you. I gasped. That is an absolute, despicable lie. David would never, ever. I know that now, Julian said quickly. I confronted her. I told her that didn't sound like the man I knew. She lost it. Told me I was calling her a liar, that I was taking your side. She broke up with me the next day. He fell silent, stirring his coffee with a shaking hand. I'm sorry, he said. I should have known. I should have seen it. He then pulled out his phone. She used to send me texts. Rants. All these messages about you, about her dad. I kept them. I don't even know why. He hesitated, then turned the phone towards me. I scrolled through the messages, my breath catching in my throat. It was all there, in black and white. A long, documented history of calculated lies, of venomous, manipulative stories designed to isolate her, paint her as a victim, and paint me as her tormentor. There were even messages gleefully recounting how she had gotten money from him, from David, from others. When I looked up, my vision was blurry with tears, but my mind was diamond-sharp with clarity. This was it. This was the truth. It wasn't just my word against hers anymore. Julian, I said, my voice steady and clear. Would you be willing to let me have copies of these? And would you be willing to talk to Liam Albright's family? He looked at me, the sadness in his eyes replaced by a dawning understanding, and then a flicker of resolve. He had been a victim of her deceptions, too. She's marrying Liam Albright? He asked quietly. I nodded. He let out a long breath. That poor guy. He has no idea. He met my gaze. Yes, he said. I will. I left the coffee shop feeling not triumphant, but heavy with a grim purpose. The drizzle had stopped, and a sliver of pale sun was breaking through the clouds. It felt like a sign. The fog was finally beginning to lift. I had no idea what the fallout would be, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. I was no longer a character in Chloe's twisted fiction. I was about to become the author of my own story again, and its next chapter would be the truth. The rehearsal dinner was held at the Cannery, a beautifully restored waterfront building with exposed brick walls and massive windows overlooking the bay. The room was filled with the soft glow of candlelight, the murmur of happy conversation, and the scent of salt water and expensive perfume. I watched Liam's parents, the Albrights, circulate with quiet grace, their faces beaming with pride. I saw David, my handsome, kind David, looking so happy, so relieved, believing that this wedding was the dawn of a new and peaceful era for our family. A knot of guilt and sorrow tightened in my stomach. I was about to shatter this beautiful illusion. I had spent the last 2 days in a state of quiet resolve, preparing. Julian had sent me the screenshots, and I had printed them, along with a few other pieces of evidence I had gathered, bank statements showing the regular, inexplicable withdrawals, a copy of the exorbitant wedding budget. I placed them all in a simple manila envelope that now felt as heavy as a lead weight in my handbag. My plan was not to cause a public scene. That was Chloe's style, not mine. My plan was to speak to Mr. and Mrs. Albright privately. To give them the truth and let them, as Liam's parents and the hosts of this grand affair decide how to proceed. It was the only way I could see to stop this travesty without destroying my own dignity in the process. Toasts were being made. Liam stood, his arm around Chloe, his eyes shining with a love so pure it was almost unbearable to witness. He spoke of Chloe's beauty, her spirit, her supposed vulnerability. "She has such a big heart," he said, looking at her with utter devotion. "And I promise to protect it and to protect her for the rest of my life." Chloe beamed, lifting her champagne flute. Then, her eyes found mine across the room. There was no warmth in them, only a cold, reptilian flicker of triumph. It was the look of a victor, and it solidified my resolve. When the toasts concluded and people began to mingle again, I saw my chance. Mr. Albright Thomas was standing alone for a moment by the window, looking out at the lights of the fishing boats in the harbor. I took a deep breath and walked towards him. "Thomas," I said quietly, "forgive me for interrupting. Could I have a private word with you and Eleanor? It's of the utmost importance." He looked at me, his kind face creased with concern at my tone. "Of course, Annalise. Is everything all right?" "No," I said, my voice shaking slightly despite myself. "I'm afraid it's not." He led me to a small, private office off the main hall and fetched his wife. They sat on a small leather sofa, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. My hands trembled as I opened my handbag and took out the envelope. "I would not be doing this if I did not believe with my whole heart that your son's future happiness was at stake," I began, my voice low and steady. "I know you believe you know the young woman he is about to marry. I am here to tell you that you do not." I laid the papers out on the coffee table in front of them. The text messages from Julian. The bank statements. I narrated the story calmly and factually, the years of subtle manipulation, the financial extortion, the lies that had painted me as a monster and David as a weakling, the way she had turned Julian's life upside down, and finally, the threat against my career. I spoke without malice, my voice filled with a sorrow that was bone deep. This was not an act of revenge. It was an act of desperate truth-telling. They listened in absolute silence, their faces slowly changing from concern to shock, and then to a horrified, stony stillness. Eleanor's hand went to her mouth as she read the texts, her eyes wide with disbelief. Thomas's face, a mask of geniality just moments before, hardened into grim lines of anger. He picked up one of the bank statements, his jaw clenched. When I finished, the silence in the small room was deafening, broken only by the distant sounds of laughter from the party outside. "My God," Eleanor whispered, her voice a thread. "That poor young man. Julian." Thomas looked at me, his eyes searching mine. "Annalise," he said, his voice raspy. "I have known you for years. I have served on the library board with you. I know your character. And I know this must have been the hardest thing you have ever had to do." He stood up, his movements stiff. "Thank you. You have saved our son from a lifetime of misery. Now, if you'll excuse us, my wife and I have something we must attend to." They walked out of the office, their backs straight, their faces grim. I remained seated, a wave of nausea and relief washing over me. The deed was done. I didn't see what happened next, but I heard it. The music stopped abruptly. A man's voice, Thomas's, rose, firm and clear, though I couldn't make out the words. It was followed by a woman's shriek of outrage, "Chloe." Then, a babble of confused voices. I slipped out a side door and into the cool, damp night air. I didn't need to see the wreckage. I had lit the fuse and walked away, not out of cowardice, but because the explosion wasn't for me. It was for them. It was the sound of a carefully constructed world of lies imploding under the weight of a simple, terrible truth. As I walked towards my car, I saw David hurrying out of the front entrance, his face a mask of confusion and alarm, searching for me. For the first time, I didn't wait for him. I got into my car and drove away, the lights of the party receding in my rearview mirror like a constellation of dying stars. The aftermath was not a fiery explosion, but a slow, crushing collapse. The wedding, of course, was called off. The Albrights, with quiet, brutal efficiency, handled the public fallout, releasing a simple statement about the mutual decision to cancel the nuptials. But in a town as small as Port Blossom, the truth, or at least a version of it, spread like wildfire through the damp air. David came home from the rehearsal dinner that night utterly shattered. He had been confronted by a stone-faced Thomas Albright who had simply said, "Ask your wife. She did what you should have done years ago." He found Chloe in hysterics, screaming accusations, and Evelyn trying desperately to control the damage, her polished facade finally cracking. He found me sitting in the dark in our living room, staring out at the black water of the Sound. "Annalise? What did you do?" he asked, his voice hollow. I didn't turn. I told them the truth, David. The truth you refused to see. And, for the first time, he listened. I told him everything, my voice devoid of emotion. I told him about Julian, about the texts, about the financial demands that were not cries for help, but calculated acts of extortion. I told him about the final threat, the one that had targeted my past and my purpose. He sank into the chair opposite me, his head in his hands. He wept, not for the broken engagement, but for his own blindness, for the pain I had endured in silence, for the daughter he no longer recognized. "I'm sorry," he whispered over and over again into the darkness. "God, Annie, I am so sorry." It was not a magic absolution, but it was a beginning. It was the first honest moment between us in a very long time. Chloe's world imploded. Stripped of her wealthy fiancé and the future she had so carefully engineered, she turned to the one person she thought was her steadfast ally, her grandmother. But Evelyn, ever the pragmatist, saw a losing investment. She had backed the wrong horse. I learned later from a friend on the library board, who was also a distant cousin of the Albrights, what had happened. Chloe arrived on Evelyn's doorstep in Seattle, expecting refuge and a war council. Instead, she was met with a door that was metaphorically, and then literally, closed to her. "You overplayed your hand," Evelyn had told her, her voice as cold as a bank vault. "You became clumsy, emotional. You embarrassed me. You embarrassed the memory of your mother. I cannot help you now. You have made this mess, Chloe. You must now lie in it." Abandoned by her fiancé, her grandmother, and finally, faced with a father who now saw her with painful clarity, Chloe was truly alone. She stayed in her room for weeks, the silence from behind her door more unnerving than any of her rages. David tried to reach out, to offer therapy, to talk, but she refused. Eventually, she packed a bag and left, leaving only a short, bitter note on the kitchen table that said, "I hope you're all happy now." The months that followed were quiet and raw. David and I slowly, carefully, began to rebuild. We went to counseling together. He learned to see how his grief had made him a willing participant in Chloe's manipulations. I learned to voice my own needs, to build boundaries not of stone, but of self-respect. Our love, tested by fire, was forged into something stronger, quieter, more honest. The house, once filled with tension, began to breathe again. It became a sanctuary once more. About a year later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, I was walking along the promenade that bordered the marina. The air was clean, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. I saw her. Chloe. She was working at a small, open-air fish and chips stand, her hair tied back in a simple ponytail, her face bare of makeup. She looked thinner, older. As she handed a cardboard tray to a customer, her eyes met mine across the bustling walkway. There was no anger in her gaze, no defiance. There was nothing, really, except a deep, hollow weariness. I saw a flicker of recognition, a shadow of something that might have been shame, before she looked away, turning to wipe down the counter with a cloth. I kept walking, my heart aching with a complex sorrow that had no name. There was no triumph in her downfall, no satisfaction. There was only the quiet tragedy of a life derailed by bitterness and a love that had been poisoned at its source. I did not know if she would ever find her way, if she would ever understand the wreckage she had caused. That was her story to write now. As I continued my walk, the sea breeze cool on my face, I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. I had survived the storm. I had learned that true strength isn't about weathering the blows, but about having the courage to steer your own ship into clearer waters, even if it means navigating through a maelstrom. My life in Port Blossom was quiet once more, but it was a different kind of quiet, not the quiet of absence, but the resonant quiet of hard-won peace, of self-possession, of a love that was, finally, built on the bedrock of truth.